right, we now have a brand new segment that Sean has come up with and wants to introduce to you all. Sean, do you want to tell us what this brand new segment is?
Yes, this is a segment I've been wanting to add to the podcast for a little bit here, but we have been very busy, or more specifically, Jonathan, you have been very busy. There's not been room to just add random stuff on the podcast, but I've been getting back into trying to properly read books, which is a thing I used to do before I became a teacher who teaches books, which is very ironic, but you just don't have a lot of time. So I'm adding a new segment onto the Purely Academic podcast. I do not know how frequently it will be, but we're going to talk about Mr. Chapman's book report.
It's Mr. Chapman's book report. We're going to learn about books with Sean.
There you go. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for the jingle. So I just figured it'd be fun to bring some true culture to our podcast called Purely Academic, where we mostly talk about video games and movies and stuff, but proper narrative art, which is what books are. Everything else is just an imitation. And so for the inaugural episode, I'm going to talk about a book I actually finished quite a while ago, but it was the thing that made me want to talk about it on the podcast, because I was like, this would be an incredibly irrelevant thing to talk about on the podcast, that there's no reason, there's nothing else going on. I have no idea how many listeners would have read this, though it is a very famous book. We're going to talk about East of Eden by John Steinbeck, the novel from 1952, what Steinbeck himself considered his magnum opus, what I would probably think that the modern critical consensus would also say is his magnum opus, though there's a debate between that and Grapes of Wrath, which at the release of East of Eden, most people preferred Grapes of Wrath, but I think over time East of Eden has perhaps overtaken it in the broad critical consensus. East of Eden, this is a great book. If you just want a general recommendation, it is a 2 thumbs up. You should read it. It's fantastic. And just a few things I want to mention about East of Eden. One, it is a legitimately good read. So if you're someone who is interested in just kind of reading a book, not just for intellectual purposes or whatever, but want something that's entertaining to read, I do legitimately think that East of Eden is a very entertaining book. I mean, I think Steinbeck is like one of the more entertaining of the kind of great 20th century American authors. But East of Eden specifically, it's got a few things that make it a very fun book to read on top of its sort of like intellectual and artistic value. It's very well paced. It is a long book, relatively long, broadly speaking, at about almost 600-ish pages in the Penguin Classics edition, which is what I have. But that's not like obscenely long. That's like a long young adult novel kind of length. But it is broken up into fairly short chapters, which is a thing that I always think is really good for a longer book, is to really sort of subdivide it into very specific chapters that give it a more episodic structure. And that's very true of East of Eden. It covers a lot of material because it covers the entire life of the main character. And so there's a lot going on. It moves very quickly. So even though it's a longish page count, it is a very breezy kind of read because it gives you lots of interesting things happen constantly. And there are lots of good stopping points where if you only have a little bit of time to read, like say 10 minutes at the beginning of your English class that you're teaching when everyone's doing their independent reading and you have to read a book too, where they're never going to fucking read if you're not reading. It's a very good book for that very specific scenario. I can personally vouch for. It's also very entertaining because the contents of the book are relatively sort of salacious, I suppose. It's got lots of violence. It's got lots of sex stuff in it. There's murder. One of the main characters, the sort of antagonist of the book, in the final sections of the book, becomes a madam of a brothel that specializes in BDSM. So if you want something that's got like some juicy kind of popular content, this book has that. In the first 30-ish pages, the main character is almost murdered by his own brother. So this is not some sort of like highfalutin, fancy pants novel. This is not like a James Joyce kind of book that's very kind of about like purely social themes and stuff and is not heightened in the way that lots of other entertainment is heightened. This is a very kind of heightened book in some of those ways, which is fun. So if you're just looking for a fun read, I think East of Eden is a good book in that regard. But of course, you also want like something that enriches you intellectually, and I think East of Eden certainly qualifies for that. It is a very interesting book in terms of its themes. The overall setup of the book is it is about 2 families, broadly speaking. Primarily, it's about the Trask family, with the protagonist of the book being the character Adam Trask, whom you follow from his childhood all the way to his adulthood and him raising his kids. But then he also intersects with a family called the Hamilton family, which live in the Salinas Valley in California. And the Hamiltons are interesting because they have a pseudo-autobiographical component, because it is based on Steinbeck's own family lineage. So Steinbeck features himself in the book as a first-person narrator that is recounting the events of the story from like documents, basically, is the sort of conceit of the novel. He doesn't interject that kind of personal narrative voice much in the book, but it is the overall framework, and it's through the sense of like his mother and I guess like grandfather or great-grandfather, like that side of things is heavily involved with the Trasks, and he's kind of recounting it after all that has happened, because the book is set at the end of the 19th century and then ends around the outset of World War I is kind of where the book stops. So it's about these two families, primarily the Trask family with Adam Trask, who lives on the East Coast and by the midpoint of the novel has moved to the Salinas Valley in California and starts interacting with the Hamiltons. And at that point, you also get the sort of probably most obvious feature of the book, which is its biblical themes and biblical allusions, obviously coming from the title East of Eden, which comes from the last line of the Abel and Cain story, because that's where Cain settles after killing his brother, is in some place east of Eden. So the book is very interested in very kind of biblical ideas around free will, primarily, around like, what is it to be a good person? Are you predestined to be what you are? Are you destined by fate? Are you destined by some sort of divine intervention? Are you destined by genes? Are you destined by the way that you are raised and the people who raise you? Or is there some sort of like additional factor, some true free will that allows you to deviate from all these things that set you on a path and to be able to live a good life on the terms that you define it? That's what I would say is the overall theme of the book. And it explores it through this generational story where Adam Trask is a man who is trying to express his own free will, is trying to break out of these cycles that he is born into with his family. And those cycles reflect the biblical stories of Adam and Eve. Obviously, the character's name is Adam, but it also reflects the Abel-Cain story because he has a brother, Charles. You have an A, Adam, C, Charles, so you have an Abel and Cain equivalent there. And then he sort of seemingly is able to break out of it, but he does not truly break out of it and ends up replicating those cycles for his own children. And so at the midpoint-ish of the story, it starts becoming more about him being a father and him raising his children. What lessons has he learned? What lessons has he failed to learn? And then where do his kids take it from there? Incidentally, if you have seen the movie version from the 50s with James Dean, that is based on the last third of the book, which James Dean plays one of the kids of Adam Trask. So if you know the book from that film, that's the context of when that film takes place. It's just adapting the last section of the book, not the whole thing. So yeah, those biblical themes are very compelling, very interesting. I think one of the things that makes it work really well is because John Steinbeck is not sort of shy about it. He's bringing it in like metatextually and very directly into the text as well. Like the characters are actively aware of the fact that these events are like similar to and replicating or paralleling events from the Bible. There is a very big chapter around the middle where three of the main characters, Adam Trask, Samuel Hamilton, who's the head of the Hamilton family, and my favorite character in the book, Mr. Lee, who is the Chinese sort of manservant that serves Adam Trask, who is a guy who's like pretending to be the cliche Chinese guy who doesn't know anything, but he's actually the smartest person in the book, and he's just fooling everybody else because everybody else is racist. They have this big, long conversation about the Abel-Cain story and what it means for humans. And it's like this like 20-page long dissection of that story itself within the narrative of East Eden by the characters of East of Eden. And so it is a book that is not afraid of just sort of very blatantly and overtly diving into what its themes are. And that's what makes it, I think, way better than it would otherwise be. Because I think it would be a bit eye-rolly when you notice the third pair of characters that are named, have an A name and have a C name, that the book is constantly doing that. And it's kind of, playing with those pairings and playing with that Abel-Cain symbology. And I think by just saying, no, that's what we're doing, I'm not trying to be clever. Like I'm inviting the reader into this intellectual space to interrogate these ideas, because it feels like John Steinbeck is not presuming to have answers to these questions. He's trying to pose these questions in 100 different ways to see what the reader makes of them. And by doing this sort of big Abel-Cain literary criticism piece in the middle, he is actively inviting the reader into the same intellectual space in which he, the author, is occupying, to give the reader space to interrogate those ideas along with Steinbeck. Because, of course, the concept of free will and what is it to be a good person are not things that have clear-cut answers. The last big thing I want to talk about is my other favorite character. I just said Mr. Lee's my favorite. My second favorite character in the book is Kathy, who is the antagonist and is Adam's wife and the mother of his children. Though are they his children or not, biologically speaking, is an open question in the book, but that's a bigger thing. But Kathy is fantastic. She is basically a psychopath. So she is this woman who is, as I'll read a section of the book, just a brief section that describes her kind of introduction, but he describes her as a psychic monster, someone who is lacking something that everybody else has, but instead of it being a physical lack, it is a social or emotional lack. And that being like, in modern terms, we would discuss that as like sociopathy or psychopathy, her inability to feel empathy for people, but also the sense that she is trapped as a woman in a man's world where her role is so like rigidly defined and is not a role that she wants to have. And so she uses everything available to her to lie, cheat, manipulate, kill, in order to create a world where she gets to be the person that she wants to be, which ultimately is when she ends up being the madam of a whorehouse or brothel that is a BDSM house, basically, where she is using pain and domination to control these men who are powerful men in the walks of life of like broad society, but in the margins of society, which she now has domination over, they are her playthings, basically. And it's just a really fascinating character that I think like there's a lot of, you can read into with like Eve and Cain, that she is sort of paired with in a weird combination of those two biblical figures, but also just as an interesting, I think, sort of interesting and somewhat troubling kind of feminist figure, in the sense that she some ways represents the sort of very misogynistic ideas of women that you see in characters in the Bible. But I would argue that Steinbeck is doing that very intentionally in order to create this really harsh criticism of the place that women are given in I would say modern society, but certainly in his society in the 1950s in which he was writing the book. And that if you were someone who is not content with the very narrowly defined role you were given as a woman, you basically had no recourse. And that is the thing that turns Kathy perhaps into the monster that everybody else sees her as and is the antagonist of the book. And she is a like both deliciously evil Cruella de Vil-esque character that just does awful things. Again, she kills people in the book. She's just like absolutely evil, but she's also, I think, very sympathetic at the same time, because you see that she does have an inability to perceive what it is that she's lacking compared to the other people around her, but that also, if she had been born a man, she would not have had any of the problems she has in life, because she would have been an incredibly successful CEO or general or something, right? She would have been able to occupy this position of violent power that men are allowed to occupy in society, that women are not. And because she is not a man, she doesn't get to have that. And so I think she's a very interesting character. So I just want to read a brief section from her introduction, just because this was a part that made me think a lot when I read it, just about, kind of some of the people that exist in our world today. I thought it's an interesting way that Steinbeck describes what he considers monsters. So this is from the beginning of Chapter 8 of East of Eden, introducing the antagonist of the book, Kathy Ames. I believe there are monsters born in the world to human parents. Some you can see, misshapen and horrible, with huge heads or tiny bodies. Some are born with no arms, no legs, some with 3 arms, some with tails or mouths in odd places. They are accidents, and no one's fault, as used to be thought. Once they were considered the visible punishments for concealed sins. And just as there are physical monsters, can there not be mental or psychic monsters born? The face and body may be perfect, but if a twisted gene or malformed egg can produce physical monsters, may not the same process produce a malformed soul? Monsters are variations from the accepted normal, to a greater or less degree. As a child may be born without an arm, so one may be born without kindness or the potential of conscience. A man who loses his arms in an accident has a great struggle to adjust himself to that lack. But one born without arms suffers only from people who find him strange. Having never had arms, he cannot miss them. Sometimes when we are little, we imagine how it would be to have wings, but there is no reason to suppose it is the same feeling birds have. No, to a monster the norm must seem monstrous, since everyone is normal to himself. To the inner monster, it must be even more obscure, since he has no visible thing to compare with others. To a man born without conscience, a soul-stricken man must seem ridiculous. To a criminal, honesty is foolish. You must not forget that a monster is only a variation, and that to a monster, the norm is monstrous. It is my belief that Kathy Ames was born with the tendencies or lack of them, which drove and forced her all of her life. Some balance wheel was misweighted, some gear out of ratio. She was not like other people, and never was from birth. There you go. So that's East of Eden. I give it 5 out of 5 stars, which is the rating system I've just now invented for Mr. Chapman's book report. Top recommendation. I think people should read it if you've not.
Well, that's excellent. I've been getting back into reading more too. It's fun. Reading is good. I think you could even say reading is like a rainbow.
It is, Jonathan. It is a reading rainbow.